So both Ubuntu 18.10 and PopOS 18.10 were released last month, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at both of them and comparing them in terms of gaming performance. Now everybody knows about Ubuntu, but I think PopOS is underrated. PopOS is a Linux distribution produced by System 76, which is probably most well known for their hardware, specifically their laptops. In many ways, PopOS is effectively a clone of Ubuntu 18, but there are a number of features that make it unique. Most specifically, its focus on privacy and security. PopOS encrypts your file systems by default, which is pretty darn cool. It also uses Elementary OS's App Center instead of the Ubuntu Software Center, which itself is a fork of GNOME software. So since this is a comparison and benchmark video, I thought that it would be fun and fair to compare the system resource usage. Now this was incredibly surprising. PopOS consumes more memory at idle after startup than Ubuntu does. And the reason why this is so surprising to me is because Ubuntu has several services running by default that PopOS doesn't, specifically the Snap daemon and the LXD daemon. You can also see that GNOME software consumes more memory than the Elementary App Store, also called PopShop. I also noticed that Ubuntu consumed more CPU at idle on average than PopOS. And like I said earlier, PopOS is effectively a clone of Ubuntu, and as such they use pretty much the exact same stack. They're both using GNOME 3.30.1, although they are obviously styled differently. They're using the same bash version, they have a similar number of packages. They are almost identical. PopOS obviously has its own repository along with some daemons that are running to help things like firmware. But one thing that PopOS does ship by default that Ubuntu doesn't is the latest NVIDIA drivers. For the benchmarks in this video, I'm going to be using the NVIDIA 410.57 drivers because those ship by default on PopOS. On Ubuntu, we're going to be using the 390.87 driver because again, that's what's by default on Ubuntu. And lastly, I decided to forego the CPU benchmarks because, like I said, these distros are so damn similar to one another. When I did some cursory tests, the results were pretty much the exact same, so we're just going to skip right ahead to the gaming benchmarks. And we'll go ahead and start with Mad Max using the Vulkan beta. Now I probably spent the most time benchmarking Mad Max because the difference between the two distros is so large. I don't have any explanation as to why there is such a big difference other than the drivers. Now I read that the NVIDIA 410 driver has some performance improvements specifically for Vulkan, but I mean, as you can see, this is a pretty big difference. The Mad Max gameplay was absolutely buttery smooth. It was incredible. By default, Mad Max uses OpenGL. You have to actually opt into the Vulkan beta, and I'm not sure why it's a beta because I didn't run into any problems and it ran perfectly. Next up, we've got another Vulkan game, Rise of the Tomb Raider. Now this game runs notoriously poorly on my hardware, and even though it's a Vulkan game, there's not much of a difference compared to Mad Max. In my opinion, the benchmarks for Rise of the Tomb Raider are pretty poor because they're kind of static. There's not really much action happening. It's usually Lara standing with like the camera moving around and stuff. If you look at the gameplay in the background, it is not good. It's choppy, and it was choppy on both systems. The 2-point difference is probably just a standard deviation, so I wouldn't say that PopOS has an advantage over Ubuntu here. Next, we've got an OpenGL game, Deus Ex Mankind Divided. This game also ran exceptionally poor. This is the low preset, 30 frames a second. Again, looking at the gameplay footage, I don't think 30 frames a second is terribly accurate. I guess it's a good baseline, but man, the gameplay was very choppy. It surprised me to see that it runs on OpenGL. Much like Hitman, I think Deus Ex would greatly benefit from the Vulkan treatment. I mean, even on the low preset, this is barely playable. Next in line, we've got Shadow of Mordor, OpenGL using the high preset. The game ran really well on both distros. And the last game on the list is Battlefield 4. Now, this is kind of a weird one, and let me explain how I benchmarked it. When you're playing a network game, you can go to the video settings and do a system performance test. This performance test is obviously not a benchmark, but it does take an average of your current frames per second. And using the test map, I went to each capture point and then used the average results between the tests. Now the results of this benchmark is surprising because DXVK is converting DirectX to Vulkan, but with the Mad Max benchmark we saw a huge difference between Ubuntu and PopOS, and I'm assuming that deals with the drivers because the later NVIDIA driver is supposed to have Vulkan optimizations. But that obviously wasn't the case in Battlefield 4, and I'm not sure why. DXVK is obviously more complex than just straight up Vulkan, so maybe there's some loss in translation happening, I don't know. I was expecting a way bigger difference here, but it was pretty much the same. Now you may have noticed that the charts I used here in this video are not from the Phoenix test suite, and that is simply because lots of the benchmarks were broken. I couldn't get them to work. Making this video was actually pretty involved because I had to install both distros on my hardware, and I spent maybe a quarter of the time fighting with the test suite, and I ended up just giving up and collecting the data myself. I still think it's a good tool, but it's weirdly temperamental on when it works and how it works, and I don't really know. I used to do a lot more benchmarks like these, but they're pretty involved and not terribly easy to make. There's collecting the data and then making the charts and then recording the footage and then editing it all together, and it's a pretty involved process. So if you like it, definitely let me know. And also let me know if there's things that I can improve on as far as presentation or data or anything. I appreciate all your support, and thanks for watching.